In this session, we're going to take a look at services. And I've already started a project called BA-services with a single activity called main service activity. And of course, I'm here on the UI file, which is typically how we get started. So I'm going to modify this text view first. And what we're going to do is give it an ID, at plus ID / txt out. It's going to be our output display. And what we want to do is give it a larger text. First of all, text is going to be 0. (40sp). Let's make that fill the screen. And we'll give it some gravity as well. Okay. And next I'm going to add 2 buttons called button start and button stop below this guy. Put a button here. We'll call that button start. Seems overly complicated for what it just did. Okay, and the text for the button is going to be start. Then I'm going to add another button on this side. And this one is going to be called button stop. And this will be stop as the text. So that's basically our user interface. Those 2 buttons and this text view. So the idea is we're going to create a service that runs in the background outside of our UI. When we click the start button, it's going to start counting off seconds. When every second or so, it's going to update our user interface and show us this information. And eventually we can hit stop to stop the service from running. So let's save this user interface and close it. And let's now take a look at the code that we need to write. So before we even get to our main application, which will call the service, we need the service itself. So a service is really nothing more for us than a new class. And this new class is going to be called timer service. And it needs to superclass from Android app service instead of Android app activity like we've previously done. Okay, and there it is. You can see we automatically get this iBinder, which we're actually not going to use today. And what we're going to do is set up some information and some constants and things like that for our service up front. So first thing we need is a broadcast action. And this is going to be a public static final string. Should have started with that, I guess. And it's equal to, it's going to be our package name followed by the name of our class. So that's how we can identify this particular service. Next, we're going to create a handler, and this is something we're going to reuse throughout the service. The handler basically is going to be responsible for running our job. It's going to kick something off every second or so. So we create a new instance of a handler and initialize it. And the handler is actually also responsible for sending data to our user interface. Let's create an intent. And let's create a variable that's going to store the start time. Okay, so those are our variables. Now let's create a runnable, which is really a new thread. And this is what we want the thread to run when it's doing its thing. So we haven't written get current data yet, so this doesn't exist, and it's actually going to cause a problem. And we want the information updated through our handler every second. So basically, we want this operation to run once every second. Okay, now next thing we need is our get current data routine. Okay, and this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to create an instance of the calendar. We'll call it O current time. We're going to save that information into milliseconds. Okay, we get the difference between current time and the start time, which is currently 0. And if we divide that difference by 1000, which is a millisecond, we're going to get the number of elapsed seconds. So then what we need to do is bundle this up as part of our intent. And we can broadcast this out. Okay, that looks good. Now we want to stop the broadcasting on the undestroy method. So I'm going to add one of those. Oops, didn't want to do that. Undestroy. Okay, there it is. Okay, remove callbacks and send to UI is what we want to clear up. And I'll actually put that here instead of that to-do list. Okay, and that looks pretty good. So then we're almost there. We have a service intact, but it doesn't have a onCreate method. So I'm going to add an onCreate method, and basically in the onCreate method, we're going to do something very similar to what we did in getCurrentTime. We're going to initialize this handler, and we're going to start the timer, which is right now at 0. We want to get the current time in milliseconds. So let's add that method right here and create. Why do I keep doing that? Okay, there's our onCreate method. So let's set up our intent. And the intent for what? Well, for our broadcast. Okay, in case something is going on already, let's remove it first, and then we'll start it again. So this usually doesn't happen, meaning it's not that you're going to have one running and then you're starting another one. So this line usually won't do anything. But if for some reason this failed, and it failed to destroy it the last time around, this will clean it up if we're restarting it. And so that's it. Our service is in place. So the onCreate event really initializes our intent. So this is just our identifier to the rest of the world. And the reason why we need the intent is because it carries the data with it. So the elapsed time information is part of that intent. And this is how our main method, our main activity is going to be able to interact with what our service is doing. Because if you notice, our service does not have any kind of a user interface. There's nothing here for us to call that's going to show us something on the screen. So everything's kind of working behind the scenes internally. As you can see, this is what we're going to run and how often. And we're sending this off on a different thread. So what actually ends up happening is instead of running in the user interface thread like our main activity, this creates its own new thread, runs the operation, and returns some result, which is then packaged into this intent and is broadcast out to the rest of the world. If anybody's listening, great, and they'll be able to pick up that information and do something with it, like we're about to in our main service activity. If nobody's listening, that's okay too. This thing is just going to continue to broadcast. So we set this up to do that once every second. Now, if you have a long-running routine, you probably will want to adjust this. Instead of having it run every second, you might want it run every 10 seconds if you know that whatever it is that you're doing takes 8 seconds to complete. So that's all kind of up to you and in your control. The idea is every time this send to UI runnable is called, it's going to start a new thread, and it's going to basically run this method. And this method can be anything you want. As you can see in our case, it's just something that converts the current time into milliseconds and then does a subtraction between the current time and the start time, which is when our onCreate event was fired, and then figures out how many seconds elapsed, and that's the information that gets returned back as a string via our intent. The onDestroy basically stops this cycle of the process repeating itself every second, and we're not really using the binder in this case. This is something that we'll tackle in a future advanced Android part of the course. So for now, this is the basics of a service. Now, this particular service will only live as long as your application is running. So if your application stops, the service stops with it. So that's an important distinction. There's two types of services that we can define, and this is the one that runs along with our application. It does not work outside of our application. All right, so what do we need to do next? The next step for us to do is to get this service to actually work within our main activity. So now it needs to interact with our two buttons and our text view. So this is our onCreate event, and here basically we need to start and stop the service depending on the button clicks. So what I'm going to do is first define the broadcast receiver and set those guys up, and then set up our onCreate method. So we're going to create an instance of this broadcast receiver class. And inside that, we're going to create a method called onReceive. All right, let's see what we got. Let's see if we can clean up some of these errors. What is it complaining about? Okay, so we're creating an instance of the broadcast receiver class, which has to have an onReceive method. The onReceive method brings in our current context and, of course, the intent that it's receiving. So this is the basically this guy right here that currently contains our elapsed time string. So notice that we're using it to basically get that information out of our intent. So here's where we get the string extra, and it's called elapsed time. Again, these names must match, just like with the shared preferences. And we're storing it in as data. And then the only other thing we're doing is we're creating a reference to our txt out object, and we're setting its text property to whatever value comes out of our intent. So that's our broadcast receiver. And in addition to that, I'm going to add a few more methods that basically unregister the receiver and register and unregister the receiver depending on which event we're in. So we could do that. We could register it in the onCreate. I'm going to choose the onResume and onPause. Why? Well, because the onCreate doesn't always fire. Remember that. Remember from our lifecycle demo that onCreate only fires when our application has been force closed. So if it's completely stopped, onCreate is the first thing that runs. But if we're sort of moving back and forth within the user interface between one application and the other, our application is stopped, but it isn't stopped to the point where onCreate gets fired again. So I'm going to use the onPause and onResume to control when the broadcast receiver is used. OnPause and onResume. Okay, so I added both of them. And in the onPause, we want to unregister. Okay, we want to do one of these. And in the resume, And on resume, we basically want to start our broadcast receiver. And we want to point it at our intent and our service called timer service, which is identified by this broadcast action. Okay, so that's saved. The last part of this is we need to basically set up our uncreate event. So first I'm going to add a private variable called intent. So this is how we're going to connect to our service. Okay, get a reference to our text box. Reset it to 0. Here come our buttons. Okay, again, I like to do that automated way of creating my code. Okay, and button stop is the other guy we're working with. Okay, so our methods are set up. So on button start, we want the service to start. So we're going to call start service, and we're going to pass the intent to it. So this is going to basically kick things off. So we're using the intent right here. We're defining it as the timer service class. It's part of our application. And so in previous examples, and actually in an upcoming example, we're going to be using intents to start different activities. So this is one way that we could do that. You can see we can call something called service start service, pass in the intent, and it'll actually kick that service off, meaning it'll run its onCreate property. And we can also destroy the service by calling stop service, passing it the intent that we're working with. So again, this is the reason why it's a global variable that we defined up here. It's because we need to interact with it from a couple of routines that are within our button click events. All right, so if everything is correct, this should work. The only thing that I know I need to do is add this to the Android manifest file. Okay, I'm going to add that right here. And so all activities have to be registered, and of course all services. And so service, we need to give it a name. Dot timer service. And you could do it like that. You can put its full path in here, same as the broadcast receiver broadcast action name. This would work as well, but this is sufficient. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to my timer service and run this application. Okay, so if everything is set up correctly, when I hit start, this counter will start incrementing once every second. If I hit stop, it'll stop. And there we go. So now the actual work is being performed by the service, as you know, since we don't have any code in our main activity to do this kind of calculation. So every time we call it, it's going to reset itself and count down the seconds, or count up the seconds. So this is your basic introduction to services. So think of a service as a way to run something synchronously in the background and possibly update the UI every now and then. Now, you do have to know how often to update the UI, and you do have to know how to update the UI, meaning it isn't, unless you're, if you're not the person writing the service, it would be very difficult for you to figure out how to get information out of it if you don't know the names and the data types for the values that the service is returning. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind is that, again, this type of service will only run within your application. So if your application isn't running, neither is your service. So that's another important distinction. Now, where is this type of service best suited? So one scenario that comes to mind is a GPS-based application. So maybe something for runners. The idea would be that a user looks at a screen like this and clicks the start button. The start button kicks off a service, and that service is responsible for tracking the distance covered, the pace, all that information that a runner might need. And of course, the user interface could be updated. And if the application that is performing this task, this running application, is exited, obviously we no longer can keep track of the information. And that is probably what you want, because the last thing you'd want is for this service to continuously track you as you are not using the running application. So this would be the perfect scenario for when this type of service is most useful.